guys, Taylor Sievers here with Sievers Blumen Farm, and today I wanted to show you what I'm using for my cut flower garden as a weed barrier. So this is something that I was asked when I gave a talk presentation. I had a picture and I had people ask quite a few questions about it, so I wanted to explain the background of why I chose to start using this landscape fabric when I first started my farm, and kind of how we make the holes, burn the holes in the fabric, and how long I've been using it. So first of all, it's a fabric. It is not a completely solid plastic, if that makes sense. So it is made from some plastics, but it is woven, so the water can penetrate down through this. In the same token, the weeds can come up in it too if they're very strong. They can kind of pierce through it, but for the most part it's very, very thick. I've been really impressed with it. I really am happy. I don't know how I would have started the flower farm without this fabric. So it's from Dewitt. I believe it's called Sunbelt fabric. I chose to get the very large roll that's like several, I think 1,000 feet long or something like that. 300 feet long. I don't know, you can get them in different lengths, and that was the most economical for me. I purchased mine from greenhousemegastore.com 5 years ago, so I have been using the same fabric for 5 years now, and it still looks pretty good, except for some spots where we've kind of got the tiller caught up in the ends, and that's going to be easy to manage. What we're going to do is just cut off that end and then take a 2x4 and just sear the end, because that kind of helps keep the fabric from fraying, basically. So what we've done is we've just decided what our spacing was going to be, and we burned holes in this fabric, and I'm going to show you what we used to burn the holes and how we spaced things. Okay, so to burn the holes in the fabric, you're going to need some sort of torch. Now, you can use a handheld torch, that will make the holes smaller. So we were able to find a larger torch that hooks up to a separate propane tank, and I believe we got ours from Home Depot. So I'll show you what that looks like here. I liked this one because the hole size was larger, and it was really easy to use, not too difficult at all to get started. And we also got to use a larger propane tank, so we weren't having to worry about it running out while we were doing several layers of fabric. And then what we did is we created forms. So you need forms in order to get your spacing right. On our fabric, there are lines that show you, they're basically spaced 12 inches apart. So if you're doing that, it wouldn't be that hard to space them widthwise, but lengthwise, we just wanted to make sure that we were keeping adequate spacing throughout. So I set up my field in a 9x9 inch spacing and a 12x12 inch spacing. The 9x9 is my most common. So if you were only going to make one form, I would make the 9x9 inch spacing. For most cut flowers, that works out really great. There are some that may need a 6-inch spacing and even a 4-inch spacing. And I found that when I burned the holes in a 6-inch spacing, it just wasn't, there wasn't enough space between the holes it just seemed like it was mainly holes, I guess the fabric was, with this size of torch. Now I have seen it where people use just regular plastic or maybe the fabric that I use, and they use the smaller torch and it makes a smaller hole, so the landscape fabric is actually doing something. Whereas before, when we tried the 6x6 inch, these holes were so big, it just was kind of like there was hardly any fabric there, so it wasn't really worth it. When I do plant my plants in a 4x4 or a 6x6 inch spacing, they're usually in some sort of raised bed or in the high tunnel where I can kind of control the weeds a little bit better, so I'm not as worried about the weeds there. Or I'm just making sure that, I mean, most of the time those plants are close enough that they do shade out other weeds. So that's just a little tip on that. If you were going to do one size form, I would do the 9x9 inch spacing. So this is what our form looks like. This is a 9x9 inch form, and then we've also made one, you can probably see it down here, in a 12x12 inch spacing. We just use an old sheet of plywood, nothing fancy, and what we would do is we would lay this down and then we just kept flipping it down the row as we went. Another thing to note is that you can get different widths with this landscape fabric. I chose to purchase the 6-foot wide width. My beds are 4 foot wide. I placed the form down the middle, and then so there's 1 foot and 1 foot on each side of the bed. And as I lay these pieces of fabric out, they are right next to each other. So the 1 foot on one side and the 1 foot on the other side come together, and I have a 2-foot aisle. So my spacing is basically 4 foot wide beds with 2 foot wide aisles. And that works out really great. I think you can buy this in 4 foot wide or 3 foot wide, so whatever you need. Some people like to just, in their beds, they don't like to lay the landscape fabric, they just like to use the landscape fabric just for the aisles. So you can just leave that solid piece all the way down and just for your aisle, and then you don't have to worry about weeding your aisle, but maybe you weed your bed more. So those are some options. I felt like this has worked out the best for us. And I don't know what we would have done without it, to be honest. So when you look at this landscape fabric, I mentioned that it's 6 foot wide by, I think it was a 300-foot roll, but so you can tell here where the lines are I was talking about. So the lines are exactly 12 inches apart, and they kind of run, they just run across the length of it. And so you can see here my aisle, I have my 1 foot side on this side, and it meets the 1 foot edge on the other side. And so that makes my 2 foot aisle. And then these are all 9x9 inch spaced beds. So there are 5 holes across, and then they go all the way down the bed like that. And that's how I can tell whether it is a 9x9 or 12x12 inch spacing. My 12x12, there's only 4 holes across the 4 foot wide bed, but that's just to show you kind of how they're set up. A few things to note about this fabric. It is extremely hot when the sun hits the fabric. So you're going to need to make sure that when you plant your plants into it, if you haven't received any rain in a while, that you're going to need to water your plants. They will dry up very quickly, especially your little baby seedlings. Now, as they mature, they will be fine. And honestly, the foliage will shade out the black plastic, the black landscape fabric, and it will be okay. But at first, you may need to water your plants. I've actually not laid irrigation for the last 5 years. I'm in Western Illinois, right north of St. Louis, and that's worked out well for me. That doesn't mean that there weren't periods of dry spells where the plants kind of suffered and I had to bring in a sprinkler, but really I probably did that once. And then if I was doing a later planting, then I would hand water those seedlings as well, but I did not need to lay irrigation here. Now, again, every year is different, so I wouldn't count on that. Definitely don't think that you can't lay any irrigation. And I honestly think that if I would have laid irrigation some years, I would have had a better crop. So going forward, that's something that I would like to do. One thing about laying irrigation is, though, you can lay the irrigation lines on top of these and the water will still penetrate down through it. So if you're worried about there being leaks or anything like that, you can, which is what I was worried about. So I didn't really want to lay my irrigation lines underneath the fabric, not knowing if there was going to be a leak or not, and not being able to fix it if there was. So I actually saw Living Traditions Homestead on YouTube. They had done a video about that, about laying the irrigation on top. And I kind of messaged him and asked how it went that season, and he said it went great. So there was one year that I did lay some irrigation on a late planting of Lysianthus, and I just laid it on top and it worked out really well. So that's just a little tip. You don't have to lay your irrigation line under this plastic. So that, otherwise it's been really good. Definitely helped with the weeds, but you still will need to weed your garden. But I cannot imagine trying to weed the aisles and trying to weed everything with the amount of weed pressure that we've had here without this landscape fabric. So it's been a lifesaver. And I've had this again for 5 years, and they really don't show any signs of, I definitely think I could have it for longer. I definitely got this idea from Florette, actually, when I was reading her book, Cut Flower Garden. I felt like I read somewhere in there that she said she had one piece of landscape fabric that had lasted her for 13 years, 10 or 13 years. So that's why I decided to go ahead and implement this on our farm. I will say that as I'm establishing my perennial area over here, we are trying to use more of the deep mulch systems because I feel like that's adding a lot more back to the soil. And with this, it's almost like I'm taking a little bit more off the soil. And I'll explain that. When I'm done at the end of the season, I will take a mower and I will mow off the rest of anything on the top. And when I go to pull the landscape fabric up, a lot of times what happens is all of that plant material, it may get deposited back into the garden, and it usually kind of gets deposited in a big clump, but a lot of it gets taken off as well when I pull this out of the garden. And so I'm not putting all of those nutrients that were taken up by the plants and stored in the plant leaves, they're not really being put back into the soil, or at least evenly distributed throughout the soil. So going forward, we are looking to transition to more of a deep mulch system or using cover crops more. If anything, just to help reduce our weed pressure, because even though we have this down, we fight weeds every year. So don't think that you're alone in that. If that's something that you struggled with, we fight weeds every year. And I'm telling you, it's the grasses that are the worst, especially come August. So this is not bulletproof method, but if you want to establish a small cutting area, this is definitely the way to go, I think. And it's honestly, because you can reuse it every year, it does seem expensive up front, but it's been one of the best investments that we've made. So I would highly recommend trying this out if you're trying to do something on a little bit larger scale and want to kind of reduce your time weeding. So thanks for watching this video. I hope it really helped you out. Please feel free to drop us a comment or send us an email if you have any questions about this landscape fabric or anything like that, and I'll try and get them answered for you. So please, if you like this video, share it with a friend and hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.